Welcome in, I'm Artress, and I can't believe it, but we're already in OP08. At the time of this recording, we're about a week away, and I am super excited for this meta simply because we recently were introduced with the Red-Purple Law ban and also the stage ban in Lucci. So what this means is that our meta in the West is going to be very fresh. A lot of our metas up to this point have been based off of what we've seen in the East, but now it's literally the Wild West out here where we can create our own meta based off of what we feel is strong, what some decks might pop up and do well with, and then counter those decks over time. So it's a really fun time to be into the One Piece trading card game, especially if you're new. It might be a little bit overwhelming, but I also think that this is a really good starting point for a lot of people because there's really nothing to base our current meta off of except for what we come up with. So that's really cool. Really like that. I think a lot of competitive players, seasoned players, will really appreciate that as well. So before we get into the actual tier list, I did want to make a quick side note that's unrelated to any of this. It was about this time last year, I thought about uploading One Piece card game style content on a consistent basis. I really enjoyed the game and I was already playing games in the sim and I figured why not go and try to make content out of it. But I didn't want to do something where I just uploaded a video here and there, and I wanted to be more consistent and stick with it. And it's been an entire year of all of that, and I can't thank you guys enough for the support. I really do appreciate all the subs, all the comments, all the likes, the people that join the Discord, show love there. Really appreciate you guys. Thank you all for the year of support, and here's to another year. If there's any kind of content that you want to see outside of like the tier list or the deck profiles, please let me know. There's plenty of stuff I can do, but I would like to hear from you guys as well. What would you guys like to see outside of the stuff I already do? So before we get into the tier list, a couple things to note here. These are my opinions. It's totally subjective. I am not trying to offend anyone. If you get offended that your leader is not in a tier that you think it should be, it's totally fine. Please let me know in the comments, of course. Please keep it respectful. That's all I ask. There's a few things that you should know about the tier list itself. The S tier are the meta-defining. These are the decks that you're going to be seeing winning multiple times, taking a bigger portion of the pie chart in some of the bigger tournaments like regionals or treasure cups. We'll probably see these consistently be at the top. The A tier event toppers are also going to be in there, but probably not as frequently. They're probably going to be taking up a smaller section of that pie chart as far as overall representation, and then also top 32 representation as well. Competitive decks are ones that I can see being in the top 64, probably getting into the top 32, maybe even top 16 quite often, and causing some trouble for some of the A and S tier decks. The C tier, which is Leave It Locals, these are decks that I don't quite see doing that hot in some of these bigger tournaments like Treasure Cups or Regionals, and you can probably expect to do like 5 and 4 records out of a 9-round tournament, maybe 4 and 5. I think that these decks have strengths to them, but they're not necessarily either consistent enough or have enough support. Maybe there's a leader that has the same color and it's just better overall. But these decks will prove to be decent at local level events. And then the F tier, this does not mean that these are awful decks, but I would not try to play these going into a big tournament. I would not say that they're consistent enough or they just don't have enough firepower behind them. But if it's in the F tier, it doesn't mean it's a complete bomb, so please don't get mad if your leader is in the F tier at the end of the day. So what you're seeing right here is the framework for the OP08 meta. Right now, this is what I thought the OP07 meta would end up being. And I think I got a fair amount of these correct. There are a few that are blatantly wrong, like Rebecca, which I made a video for, which I'm super happy to eat my words on that one because I've been playing Rebecca since it came out and I want it to be good, but felt like it wasn't the greatest, and then I put it in the F tier, and then I realized I was just wrong. So it's definitely not in the F tier, but as you can see, some of these are correct. I think Red-Purple Law ended up being clearly a meta-defining deck. Black-Yellow Luffy, also very good. And then we had Enel, which is a very solid deck as well. I think Lucci probably could have been S tier at the end of the day, but I digress. This is the framework that I had for OP07. So instead of going through each one of these in depth, a lot of these will probably stay where they're at, but we'll move some of them around on the tier list where they need to be. Starting off with Red-Purple Law, this is clearly just an F tier because it got banned, so any of the F tiers are at the bottom of F. Instead of an RIP section, we're just going to put it at the F tier bottom part of it. So Black-Yellow Luffy, a leader that I think has been really hard for a lot of people to pilot, but also for the ones that do pilot it well, has been popping off and is really hard to go against, especially if you're any of the black decks like Moria or Lucci. Black-Yellow Luffy is just a menace, and I think it will continue to be a menace in the OP08 meta. And I know a lot of people say that Blue gives it problems, that Bonney gives it problems. A good Black-Yellow Luffy pilot will be able to play around The Pudding from blue will be able to handle the bigger bodies with Bonney. A lot of Black Yellow Luffy players have been switching to a more control style build with the 10 cost Kuzans. So that I think will keep it in the meta overall. Enel is one that didn't get too much support in OP08. And to be fair, Black Yellow Luffy didn't really get much support either, but it's just a really strong deck off the bat. I think Enel doesn't really have any good matchups, but it also doesn't really have too many bad matchups either. There's, of course, Nami, and then Bonney is a little bit of a problem for Enel. So I'm going to put Enel down at the A tier. I think it's a deck that will continue to be in the top tier. It might win a tournament or two, but I don't know if it will consistently be able to win tournaments back to back to back. So I'm going to put it at the A at the top of event toppers for right now. Lucci, even though Stage got banned, I think that Lucci gets some nice support with the 7-cost Jack. That's going to help you filter out your hand a little bit easier while also being able to KO something on the field. And once Jack is on the field, the only way to really get rid of it is either Red Rock, Raigo, or swing really big into it. You can reduce it, but you're spending a lot of resources to get rid of it. And so Jack is a great addition to the Lucci deck. And to point out that Stage has been banned for Lucci, I don't think really matters, because what Lucci ends up doing instead is running like Soap Sheeps, Ice Ages, other cost reductions. So you will still be able to get that cost reduction, obviously minusing your hand a little bit more in the process, but I still think Lucci is going to be an extremely strong deck, and I'm going to bump it up to the S tier for OP08. Bonney is a leader that I think really benefits from the Red Purple Law ban. One thing that Bonney, I think, has a little bit of issues dealing with in the early to mid game is having a bunch of bodies on the opposition side of the board, and Red Purple Law was able to do that while also removing things on Bonney's side of the board. And of course, if you dropped an 8-drop Kid, which is usually the reason that Bonney can stall out and win against aggro decks, with a couple of cost reductions from Red Purple Law, you could just bottom deck it and continue swinging at face. But with Red Purple Law out of the way, and some of the other aggro decks not doing nearly as well into Bonney, I think Bonney has a place in the S tier meta-defining leaders. I actually think it's probably one of the best, if not the best leader as of right now. With Red Purple Law gone, you're now able to comfortably set up a Zoro for a lot of your games, and the 9-cost Zoro is just, once it's on the field and it's unanswered for a turn, you turn the tides if you're losing, and you're instantly winning if you are already ahead. So I'm going to put Bonney at the top of S tier. I think that's a pretty fair place for it to be. All right, Gecko Moria is a deck that I think is consistently very strong. Being able to recur bodies and get value off of those bodies is amazing for this leader, and I think just any leader that can do that and spit out bodies while also swinging, and like I said, getting the on-play effects for a lot of these bodies that they're putting out is very potent. And I think that Gecko Moria, even though it doesn't get much support in this set, it's not really making use of Jack. I think it's just a strong deck that got a lot of support from the start, and I think it continues to do well. I think it has good matchups into a lot of the leaders out there, and I think it has a fair shot at beating a lot of the decks below it. So I'm actually going to bump Gecko Moria slightly above Enel. I think it's one that can consistently do well against Enel. I think a good Enel pilot can beat Moria more days than not, especially with the 7-cost Enel. However, on average, I would say that Moria beats Enel at the end of the day. Katakuri is a leader that I will continue to say is a really strong leader. It's just a generically good effect, being able to look at the top of you or your opponent's life and then place it wherever you'd like. And on top of that, be able to have bodies come out of life on triggers, play 10-cost Big Mom, and it does get support usually whenever just yellow good stuff comes out. In OP08, we do get like the 5-cost Nami, which is a decent trigger that will allow you to have a body on the field that can KO something that's 5-cost or less. And on top of that, we do get some support with the starter decks. And I think the blocker Katakuri that is able to flip a life over to see what it is and then put a Rested Dawn under your leader so that you're able to get the leader effect. Really great effect. A blocker that has very strong utility for this leader is, I think, exactly what this leader needs. And because of that, I'm going to keep it in the A tier. I think it gives Enel a lot of problems if Enel doesn't see the 7-cost Enel. The 7-cost Enel just seems to be the thing for Enel that makes it strong against a lot of these top tier decks. However, Katakuri, with the support coming in 8.5, which is what I'm calling the starter deck like meta. By the way, I'm also going to be considering for these leaders. Katakuri belongs in the A tier. Perona, I put in A tier as well, and I think it still stays there. I actually think it gets bumped up above these decks. It becomes a very strong control deck, not as strong as Lucci, of course. It's kind of like in between Bonney and Lucci. It plays some big bodies like Zoro, but it also can take care of the board if it needs to with Ice Ages and the Ryumas. So I'm going to put Perona above Katakuri and Enel and keep it in the A tier. I think all of these decks can beat each other at the end of the day. I think Enel has advantage against Perona. I think if Katakuri gets rolling, it can beat it. But I think in a vacuum, I think Perona is just a better leader, especially being able to just draw through your deck with the Samurai package and then be able to play out Zoro and then just efficiently be able to close out games from there. All right, Nami. Now that Red Purple Law is gone, what is Nami going to be doing? Nami is going to be doing really well in this meta. I think it thrives into decks that take too long to set up. So when you have decks like Enel, when you have decks like Lucci, maybe even Bonney, for instance, all of these decks have like one body a turn, if that, and it takes a while to get there. I think Nami really struggles against decks that can spit out a bunch of bodies and pressure the hand multiple times a turn. So seeing that all of these decks that take a little bit of turns to set up are in the top of the meta, for me, Nami is an easy S-tier meta-defining deck. I think it has great matchups against these decks in general. A good Nami pilot should be able to beat most of these decks, if not all of them. Green Uta. All right, where is this one going? I think it stays in the competitive. It might actually be like borderline A tier. And the reason for it is right now, before the starter decks come out, I think the starter decks, by the way, come out in about a month or so after OP08 release. Uta gets a film green starter deck that adds a couple of more support cards, a couple like a 2K, a 9-cost Shanks that KOs something that's rested. Doesn't matter the cost, just if it's rested. And so because of that, I think Uta, the consistency of the deck goes through the roof. It was already a really consistent deck, but now you can probably replace some of the cards in the deck that were non-film related and now just make a full film, green film related deck and probably do really well with it. The consistency of this deck is really what drives it for me. I think that it could be at the bottom of A tier. It could be top of B tier. I think I'm going to put it at the the bottom of A tier overall, considering the starter decks will be able to push it across that line, in my opinion. Blue, green, Zoro, and Sanji. I still think that this deck is really strong, and I don't think enough people are piloting it. It just has a really interesting early to mid game. You have a fair amount of aggro tools, being able to reset and bounce things back to hand. And then you can play Hody Jones if you need to in this deck. You can also play the 9-cost Zoro at this point if you want to. I think any green deck, if they really consider it, you could probably run a 9-cost Zoro, at least 2 or 3 of, and probably be okay. And so because of that, I think Zoro and Sanji probably is going to be a deck that not enough people pilot, but I think if somebody decides to go through and pilot it, we'll probably do pretty well with it, especially if the pilot is very competent. And so I think it's a competitive deck. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be consistently topping like a top 16. We just don't have enough people playing it, I think, is the problem. This could also potentially be a rogue deck, which I could make a tier list for as well. But I think Zoro and Sanji deserves a little bit better than that, in my opinion. And I think it's probably a strong competitive deck. Is it at the top of B tier? Not quite sure yet. We'll get to that as we go through the rest. Doflamingo will be the best deck in the format by the end of OP08. It has already a strong Warlord package, with Jinbei and Weevil being a very strong going second curve. And then with that, with the starter decks, you get a new Boa blocker, which is essentially like your 3-cost Doflamingo blocker. However, you're able to attack with it very efficiently because it's a 4-Dawn 6K body. I think Doflamingo will be a S-tier deck by the end of OP08. Before the structure decks come out, I think it's a strong competitive deck. But by the end of OP08, it will be an S-tier deck, in my opinion. I think Boa stays where it's at. I don't think Blue really gets a lot of great tools. I think the tools that Blue gets are targeted towards the blue-red Marco. There are a few cards like Jozu, the 6-cost Jozu, that can bounce something back to your hand, and then you bounce, I think, a 6-cost or maybe a 7-cost. I'm not quite sure which cost it is, but you can bounce a card back to your opponent's hand. Is a good card for Boa, but I think if you're going on your 6th-on turn, you'd probably just rather play your Boa Hancock 6-cost instead. So I think Boa is still a strong deck. In my opinion, it, at the start of OP08, is a worse version of Dofi in that they have very similar builds, but by the end of OP08, Dofi becomes more of a aggro deck, actually, and Boa becomes more on the control side. I don't necessarily think it will be topping as often, but I do think it will give a lot of decks up here some trouble. Yamato is a deck that I feel is very cheesy, but I've seen a lot of builds where they're building it more towards like a Wano package where they're able to heal while also aggressively pushing into the opponent. And I think for decks that are not Enel, it can be problematic, especially if they're dropping an Onami and go double attack banish. I think Yamato still has a place in like a competitive setting in the overall like regionals or treasure cup, but I don't know if it's like in the middle of competitive. I'm going to be honest, I'm probably going to put it towards the tail end of competitive, just because I don't think that green doesn't get too much support. It gets like a carrot, it gets a electrical Luna, which taps down a bunch of units. So for that, that's really strong. And I think that Yamato can really take advantage of that, freezing a bunch of your opponent's characters and then being able to efficiently put 2 of that Rested Dawn under another one of your characters. There's some really good tools in Yamato's kit for now, but I don't know if it's one that I would see competing with the rest of these, especially since a lot of these leaders are 5 life. You have Dofi, Lucci, Gecko Moria, Bonney. All of these are 5 life leaders, and Yamato just struggles closing out against 5 life leaders for the most part. It does well against a meta when there's 4 life leaders for sure, because it just takes 2 huge attacks and then your opponent has to play on defense. But when you're down to 1 life and you have a whole boatload of cards, you can actually stabilize pretty easily against Yamato. So it definitely has a competitive edge to it against some of the decks, but I'm going to put it at the tail end of B. Newgate gets some support in the starter deck that it gets. I think it gets a couple of cards that will help it with its longevity, being able to not necessarily take life with a couple of cards. I think there's like an Atmos that comes out that when you swing, you don't take your life that turn. But I don't know if it necessarily pushes it to an edge of being able to be back where in its glory days of the S tier deck that it was. A lot of these other decks being able to control the board a lot easier, and especially when Newgate's just dropping like 1 body of turn. When you have Lucci or Moria or Bonney being able to tap things down or like KO stuff, I think like Newgate has a little bit of a problem into some of those decks. A 6 life, 6k leader is just, it's not even an argument. It's great stat lines. However, a lot of the meta has caught up to what Newgate tries to do, and because of that, it still belongs in competitive. I'm going to put it down towards like a Yamato tier, where it can, you know, I think do all right, but I wouldn't expect it to do as well. I don't think it's a leave it locals necessarily deck. I think that if you take it to a locals, you probably do pretty well with it, but at a big tournament, it could be a little bit of a risk overall. Obviously, it's a meta read with Newgate and Yamato, but I'm going to put them towards the tail end of competitive. Red Purple Luffy, I think, just gets more and more support every set, which is absolutely nuts, but I think for this, I think that the 9 cost Big Mom, any purple deck should be running this, for the most part, I think. And Red Purple Luffy is no exception to that. I think the Lin that can heal 1 and then put a 6 cost into the opponent's life, very strong effect. And I think that Luffy will become probably one of the best, if not the best deck in OP09. It's just 1 set away from being that strong. But right now, it still belongs in the competitive tier. It gets a little bit of support in purple. Of course, the red support that it has with the Monkey D Dragon Rush unit that I got. Of course, the Newgates that you're already running. Those are very strong cards to have in the deck. And the 9 cost, just the addition of it is really great. Speaking of the 9 cost, that's a card I think you should be putting into your Purple Luffy decks, but also Purple Luffy, I think, gets even more support with its structure deck. So it gets a nice 4 cost 6k body in Zoro that searches out, I think, a Straw Hat. You get a 7 cost 8k body. It's like a Luffy Taro, I think is what it's called, and it brings out, I think, a 5 cost or less Straw Hat onto the field. And so being able to stack bodies, that's something that you've noticed. A lot of decks that are able to compile multiple bodies on the field at once usually have a strong place in the meta. I think Purple Luffy will bump itself up to the top of competitive, almost event topping. I think that there are some decks that maybe just are better than it overall. I think Doflamingo with its gravity blades will be able to handle purple Luffy pretty efficiently. Lucci is going to have a little bit of problem, especially if they start dropping Magellans. Katakuri will have problems, especially if Magellans drop down. I think purple Luffy will cause some problems for some of the other decks, though, in the S and A tier. And I can see it almost being an A tier deck itself after OP08.5 with the structure decks. I think Reiju is going to be a deck that I know a lot of people said it was the best deck in format after Red Purple Law got banned. I don't know if it is quite there. I think it's at the top of A. It's a strong deck that just doesn't run out of gas and can put out some really efficient bodies very early. However, it does struggle against some decks like Bonney when you have the 8-cost kid. Black Yellow Luffy is just its nightmare matchup. And I think Doflamingo, if Doflamingo is just focusing on putting as many bodies on the board and just going face, I think probably has the edge over Reiju. But Reiju is a really strong deck, and you can probably expect it to do well at a lot of these bigger tournaments. Blue Yellow Ace, I sadly am going to have to move down to the Leave It Locals. I expected more from this deck, and it didn't really get that much support into the new set. It does get a searcher that can search out a Whitebeard Pirates type or a Luffy, and it also gets, I guess, the 10-cost blue Newgate, but I'm going to be honest, it just doesn't feel good putting it in this deck because by the time you're at 10 Dawn, you're probably wanting to do something else or having to defend yourself, and you want to be at a higher, like a 7k power on your defense, rather than being a 5k power and then having your opponent discard cards. So I'm not sure if Blue Yellow Ace is quite there. I really think it's a strong deck in general, but I don't think it's quite strong enough to compete with some of these other decks in the meta. I'm going to have to bump it down to C, Leave It Locals, but I think it's one of those decks that can be a strong rogue deck. And I'm going to say this, the C tier is going to be like the top of C tier is probably more rogue, can potentially bump itself into the B tier, maybe with the right pilot. I think Vivi has potentially a strong matchup into some of these decks up here, but I don't think that we're going to see it do very well at a high tier quite often. Maybe I was coping a little too hard in OP07 by putting it in a competitive tier. I definitely think it's a really strong deck, and it's probably a rogue deck at the end of the day. So we're going to put Vivi here at the C Leave It Locals. In fact, I think I'm just going to add a row here right above it to just signify that this is like a C plus rogue tier. You know, I think that's fair. I think this can be here. I think this can be here. These decks with the correct pilots might be able to crack something that people haven't figured out or maybe aren't expecting overall. Onto the C tier, let's go through these rather quickly because I think a lot of these probably don't change too much. I think that Dragon is a deck that can do well, but it's just one where I think Red isn't quite strong enough to compete with a lot of the other decks. Of course, Dragon, you're probably playing more of a rush package, so that could be a potentially strong thing there, but overall, I think Dragon keeps in the C tier. Same thing with Foxy. Foxy doesn't get a huge amount of support. I will say, though, that it does take advantage of Black Maria, and so you can use your leader ability and not have to worry about going on minus Dawn. So maybe with the right pilot, this could be a rogue deck that people could potentially do well with. And if there's a lot of Reiju in your meta, I think Foxy actually does pretty well against Reiju. Red Yellow Sabo, I think, is one that I probably underestimated a little bit. I feel like it has a fair amount of balance between aggro and then also triggers and then kind of just sustaining itself. So it can do really well against decks that are based around removal like Lucci or Moria. Moria is less removal based nowadays, but I'd say definitely against Lucci, Red Yellow Sabo can win very easily. So I'm going to put this up into the rogue tier. Not quite competitive for me, and I don't think it's necessarily like a Leave It Locals deck. You can probably cook with this and do just well with it. Red Black Sabo is one that I think has more viability into the post Red Purple Law ban because, well, most of the removal in the game now is KO based, but I just think that the 4-life leader and the setup that it needs to get there keeps it from being a really competitive deck. It could be rogue, but I don't think it's quite a rogue deck just yet. A couple of rogue decks that I will actually bump up to like a C+ tier. I think Purple Yellow Croc, very interesting leader. Another tool for it to heal with the Lin in 9-cost Lin that it gets. And I think that it can just grind out games, but it doesn't have good removal. And I think that's the problem with this deck is it doesn't have removal for the board. Of course, Lin gives it that, but that's just like one body it can deal with, and it's not even a high cost body for the most part. So yeah, because of the lack of removal with purple yellow croc, I'm going to keep it in a rogue tier. I think it's a little bit better than Leave It Locals though. And I also think that with, once again, Red Purple Law was kind of like a boogeyman for a lot of these decks. I think that Oden, Red Green Oden, taking advantage of like being able to play Zoros and then the consistent 7k attack and then 6k defense is really strong overall. It's hard to swing into it. It's hard to pressure it. You do, at the end of the day, have some pretty big bodies coming out of it, and 5-drop 7k bodies swinging in you into the mid game is quite terrifying. And then it follows up with either Hody Jones or 9-cost Zoro. So yeah, I think that Oden is pretty strong. I think Iceburg still belongs in the Leave It Locals. It does, once again, take advantage of the purple good stuff with Black Maria, but I think that you're able to swarm the board more efficiently with your Water 7 characters, and you're probably not going to have room to play Black Maria as much. So I don't know if this deck necessarily takes advantage of Black Maria as much as other purple decks do, but it's a really strong deck in a local setting. It can overwhelm an opponent pretty easily, and the recursion it has is really strong. So I'm going to keep it at the C Leave It Locals tier. Red Green Law, I'm going to say, is a, dare I say it, competitive deck. I'm going to put it at the rogue deck. I think somebody probably needs to figure out the right build. There could be a build that takes advantage of the new animal, like the Drum Kingdom stuff that we see coming out into green and red, I believe. I think mostly red though. And of course, like just in general, the build that's already existing from like OP01 is really just a viable deck overall. Of course, you're going to have problems against Lucci. You might have problems against Bonney, but I think if you can pressure Bonney fast enough, you're going to be fine. And then depending on the build, you might be able to pressure Lucci as well. So I think Law with the right pilot, right build could be a potentially competitive deck. I think it's a little bit better than C tier though, like a C Leave It Locals tier. Now Zoro is a deck that hasn't really been, I think, too much in existence since I would say maybe OP04, 05. It's just a deck that just is generically good, and you put a lot of weenies on the board and just swing wide. And I think that there's not a lot of decks that do that. Reiju's one, and then Zoro is the other one that I can think of. I'm going to put Zoro at the top of competitive because Zoro gets a fair amount of support with the new animal support, the Drum Kingdom support, like the choppers. I think that really, just being able to spit out an entire board in a turn is just nuts. And it's almost to the point where Lucci might even have some troubles keeping up with what the amount of bodies that Zoro is putting out, especially if you're playing like the 3-cost chopper that brings out an animal rested, and then if that animal rested is the chopper that brings out a 3,000 power or less animal, and then you can on defense use a new counter event. It doesn't give you any like power, but you're able to put a body on the board if your opponent swings at you. So I think that's a really good tool against like Lucci or removal decks, because then they're going to have to, it's essentially like a trigger where they can't really play around it. They're going to have to swing regardless, and then you're able to bring a body out when they swing. So yeah, I think Zoro is in a really strong state coming into OP08. Next we have Magellan, and I'm going to be honest here, even though I kind of hyping up purple, I don't think Magellan really takes advantage of the purple support that comes out in OP08. I think Magellan really wants to play around the Impel Down package that it has with like the Mina Koala and like the 4-cost units, and then eventually spit out like 1 or 2 big bodies with like 9-cost Kaido. And I don't think that strategy is really good enough to be in a competitive setting. I'm going to bump Magellan down to the F tier. And the only reason that I'm doing this is because there's better purple decks overall. And I don't think Magellan really innovates when it comes to their deck lists. And so because of that, it's kind of stayed stagnant. And as things stay stagnant in One Piece, there's other decks that will rise above it and do better overall. So I'm going to put Magellan down to the F tier. As a reminder, this is not to offend anybody. This is just how I feel about this deck overall. Belo, I think, really benefits from Red Purple Law being banned, being able to just have 4-cost 5k bodies on the board and just spit them out from life or hand. Really powerful. However, it is one that kind of just defeats itself. It will run out of gas pretty easily, and because of that, it is a deck that I think belongs in the C tier still, but probably towards the top end of C tier. I know that I'm not supposed to be ranking these amongst each other, but I do think that Belo is on the verge of being a competitive deck. Starter deck Big Mom, mono yellow Big Mom is, I think if you're playing a yellow deck, you might as well just play Katakuri, because Katakuri just efficiently uses its Dawn better than this Lin. It's not a bad deck by any means because it has the same package overall, but I think you should just play Katakuri at the end of the day, and you could probably do well with Lin, but if you're playing this, you're probably wishing you're playing Katakuri instead. Ace is a deck that I think gets an interesting support piece in the starter deck. So 8.5, I think it can bump up to Rogue tier when it gets the 7-cost Newgate that puts a Rested Dawn, I believe, under your leader, and then you can KO a unit that is 5,000 power or less by resting it. So that, I think, will be a great addition to the Ace deck. Will it be able to compete overall? I don't think it's going to be on a competitive tier. It's like one of these decks that just, I feel like, doesn't have enough power or like oomph to get across. It's a really strong deck against some of the top tier decks, like against like Lucci. I think it has a pretty good shot at doing well. Being able to probably effectively handle Bonney's board is something that it can do. But I think it just struggles in general against all the other decks around it. But it does have potential. So I'm going to put it in Rogue because I think if somebody really dedicates themselves to this deck, I've seen people play Ace in like our current OP07 meta. I've seen people play it. I think it was an OP06 and they did well with it. And I was honestly surprised. So maybe somebody will surprise me and do well with it there in OP08. So I'm going to put it in the Rogue decks for now. I think Ivankov stays and they leave it locals. Being able to spit out a couple bodies is really good. I don't like the gimmick of going low on hand size. It's always something that I thought was just really not great about this leader, but it does make up for it by being able to spit out multiple bodies a turn. And so having bodies that are 7k in power and having anywhere from like 2 to 4 of them in your board, really strong, hard for removal decks to deal with, but I think the lack of cards in hand is really just its detriment. So I'm just going to leave Ivankov where it's at. Same thing with Kid. I think Kid is a deck that if you're playing green, just play Bonney. I think that it has a very similar package overall to what Bonney's doing, but Bonney's just a better control leader when it comes to green. Of course, green having 9-cost Zoro be its big boogeyman is, of course, the best thing here. But like I said, just play Bonney if you're going to play green. Green, yellow, Arlong, I think, is a deck that is definitely a locals deck for sure. I don't see this deck really doing well anywhere else. It's a deck that you probably take to a locals to just like have some fun with and probably do like the 50 trigger Arlong. I think that's a fun deck to play with. As far as taking it to a competitive setting and doing really well at like a regional, if you can, hats off to you, but I'm going to be honest, it's definitely a locals deck for me. Green Purple Doflamingo is a deck that hasn't really been around very often as far as like in the meta goes. It was strong when it came out, I think in OP04 and maybe a set after that, but just didn't really do much post OPO like 5. It was great against Red Purple Law, but now that Red Purple Law is gone, the Birdcage part of this doesn't really do much against a lot of the decks that have bigger bodies for sure. So I'm going to put Doflamingo in a Rogue tier. And the main reason for this, it's green and it's purple. Green is really thriving right now, and also purple getting the decent support, I think really might give some advantage to Doflamingo overall. We might see where they run the 9-cost Lin. We might see them switch out some of their top end to have Zoros. They have Hody Jones, which they could include as well, which I think is probably one of the best green cards out there, if not the best green card. So I think because of the color combination, I think it's in Rogue. I think somebody just needs to find the right deck with it and maybe get a little bit lucky with some of their matchups. Queen is a deck that probably should have been an F tier last set, to be honest, but I think it actually gets bumped back up to C tier. Because Red Purple Law is gone, I think this deck can do a little bit better. Will it do well? I don't think so overall. I think it's a deck that you could probably do fine in locals setting, but nah, I don't think this is going to be good. All right, now I think a deck that could be bumped up to the bottom of competitive will be Kaido. Starter deck Kaido. Yeah, starter deck Kaido. Believe it or not, I actually think this deck is really solid. Black Maria, I believe, was made for this deck specifically. Being able to use your leader ability, Dawn -7, and trash the top of your opponent's life, and then get all of that Dawn back. If you have a 5-cost kid on the field and your Onigashima Island, you're able to just use your leader effect for free every turn. You can find Onigashima with the 1-cost event. You also have 9-cost Lin as further kind of top end in purple. So yeah, I think Kaido has potential to be a competitive deck. I'm going to put it at the bottom of competitive because I'm not quite sure. I don't think it's a rogue deck. I think that it definitely has a lot of good support and can do very well. I just don't think it's quite going to be like up in the A or S tiers. It will struggle against a lot of these decks. but I think that it does have potential. All right, I'm putting Rosinante, green, blue Rosinante, into the rogue tier. I think this deck needs to be cooked with. I think that I think this leader just has untapped potential. I don't think anybody's really played a lot with it, and probably for good reason. One of its worst matchups is obviously black, being able to just hard remove stuff. But I think that green, once again, is really strong. Bottom decking in blue is also really strong. And the fact that this can run a cost kid, it can run Sanji into Zoro, getting two big bodies out in the same time, is really hard and can overwhelm the opponent. It is a 4-life leader, of course, but I think that doesn't really matter at the end of the day for this leader specifically. Mono Black Lucci, I don't think that this is a cooking deck at all. I think this is an F tier deck. It was a deck that I could potentially see last set, maybe doing all right with like an air door package, some of the CP9, CP0 stuff. Overall, though, I don't think this deck really does well at all. Blue Purple Croc, I don't really see this deck doing well either. I'm not sure why I put it in the C tier. Maybe there was something I saw last set that could have done well. Maybe it was like the EB01 set stuff that I thought maybe would have helped it, but I gotta be honest, like I don't really see this leader doing well either, so I'm gonna put it down in the F tier. Red Green Luffy I think has definitely potential. I don't think it's a rogue deck. I think that it's definitely understood on what it can do. It can pressure really hard and it can swing twice with its leader ability. The biggest problem with this leader ability though, it's 4 Dawn to use it, and so that takes up pretty much your entire turn, so you don't really have a lot of options to do much else. If you're able to establish a Kid and Killer and a Zoro, 9-cost Zoro, in a perfect world, you could like Kid and Killer, use your leader ability, swing it again, and then obviously be able to swing Zoro 3 times. So you can get a lot of hits in with this, but it's really difficult to set that up. But if you're able to set that up, then you're a god at that point, because that's a really, really, really hard combo to set up just because of the amount of removal in a lot of these sets that we're seeing lately. Kairos. Black Yellow Kairos, I'm sorry, is going to have to be moved down to the F tier. This deck could have had potential, but it just... it's a weird deck in like its identity. It needs to be bumping things down to 0. It needs to be able to like flip life back. It's just kind of all over the place in what it does. It has potential, but I feel like it needs too much setup, and I don't think you're going to have time being a 4-life leader with black and yellow being more late game than anything else. So you're going to get ran over by a lot of decks. Moving it down to F tier. Vegapunk is a deck that I'm going to bump up from the C Leave It Locals to the bottom end of competitive. I think that it is a deck that definitely struggled against Red Purple Law, but because Red Purple Law doesn't apply as much pressure to it as much anymore, this becomes a really interesting yellow control deck where you are fluctuating like your life and their life totals and using like Yamatos or 7-cost Big Moms or 8-cost Katakuris to really just like remove things off the board. And then Yamato traditionally is one that's been able to heal and then pop something that's like a 4 or 5 cost, especially in Enel. However, in Vegapunk, you're using it to pop higher cost things. So you're healing as much as you can, you keep your opponent at their life total, and then you use the Yamato to KO something, hopefully that's like an 8 to 10 cost. Of course, your opponent has to not be swinging at you for that to happen. In some matchups, it's possible, but I think Vegapunk is a competitive deck. Sakazuki, I'm going to say leave it locals. It could be a rogue deck. I'm going to be honest, like the rogue and leave it locals probably should just be 1 tier overall. I don't know why I split it up, but I think that this is probably fine to leave it as is. Blue and black is just a strong color combination, and that's why I'm bumping Rebecca up to rogue tier. But does Sakazuki belong in it as well? Yeah, I think so as well. I think that there's a place for this deck somewhere. Yeah, I feel like people just haven't played with it enough to really get to that level where it could be a competitive deck, but it might even be better than Rebecca in some regards just because it can attack. But I will say that it will eventually likely be a deck that can be played in a potentially competitive setting. I know I'm like skirting around and saying like it can be potentially, maybe, I don't know. But I definitely think that blue and black is just a color combination that you can't deny. It's just strong. All right, let's go through the F tier real fast. I think Hannibal is probably one that can be a leave it locals. It's a lot better than I gave it a credit for initially. Being able to ramp up and then put out some big bodies in blue and purple, like 9-cost Kaido, 9-cost Sanji, you can do 9-cost Mihawk. So I think Hannibal is definitely belongs in the leave it locals tier. The next up, Hody Jones, is one that I'm definitely bumping up to the C, leave it locals. I think I was wrong about this in the last set, or maybe I wasn't wrong here, but I think the meta shifted a little bit to allow it to be able to have a little bit more breathing room to set up the units that it needs to set up. If you're going first with Hody Jones, it's definitely got a strong going first curve, being able to play out your bodies like your Darumas, and then also you can use your Hody Jones on 7 and then set up a Zoro on 9. So yeah, I think Hody Jones has potential to do well. I'm not sure if it's going to be quite competitive, but it's definitely one that I would potentially take to locals and probably make it to the end and do well with. Purple Shanks is one that just from its get-go didn't have a lot of support, wasn't amazing, and continues to not get support, so I'm leaving it in F tier. Black-green Isho, kind of a weird deck, not really sure what it's trying to do, and I think that if you're looking to play black, play Lucci. If you're looking to play green, play Bonney. If you're looking to play black and green, just play Perona. Black-yellow Big Mom, its leader ability is what's really strange here. The Dawn ×2 when attacking. And then I think you have to pay 2 Dawn and you can heal a life by trashing a card. I think you have to be at a certain life total. I think it's like 2 or something like that. That's a Dawn intensive turn. And you're not able to play the other big things or the good things that you want to play in black or yellow. So I just don't see this deck doing well overall still. I'm leaving it at F. Kinemon could be a good leave it locals deck. I'm bumping it up from the F tier to C tier. The reason why is because Hiyori from EBO1 being able to cheat out a 5-cost Land of Wano character on your 3 Dawn turn is extremely powerful. When this deck came out, everyone talked about Okiku being the very strong turn 1 play you can make. However, you can now make a turn 2 play going first with Hiyori, so I think that is also something to take in consideration. And I don't necessarily think this deck is that awful. I think it has decent green support overall. The deck just, I think, succumbs to the other green decks, succumbs to the rest of the meta, but I would want to see people take it to locals and probably do well with. Kuro is not a green deck that I would want to take to locals and do well with. This is a deck that I think had support when it first came out, could play decent aggro. It doesn't have a lot of support now. It doesn't really do the whole like resting and getting rid of the board as easily as Bonney, so I'm keeping it in the F tier. I think Luffy doesn't really get much, so Luffy stays here. Z is one that I think might actually get bumped up to the C tier because of Black Maria, being able to use its leader ability but not have the problem of going down too low in Dawn. It has enough ramping tools to get up to 10 fast. The only problem with this leader is that it's 4 life, and so because of that, I'm leaving it at the locals tier, but it did get bumped up from F, so all you Z mains out there should be happy. Red Purple Kid, I think, also gets bumped up to C, and the reason why is it now gets Pudding, the 3-cost Pudding in purple. That's a card that I forgot to mention for the rest of the purple leaders. Being able to essentially have a second 5-cost Kid blocker effect on the field is really strong, especially if you are going first. You drop this on 3, then you drop your Kid blocker on 5, and now you're able to use your leader ability and not have to worry about going minus and Dawn. So that's really, really strong overall. And I think, like I said, with the rest of the purple decks should take advantage of the Pudding as well. And of course, King being purple, just naturally, I'm going to bump it to the C, leave it locals. I think this is a deck that if you're playing mono purple, just play Kaido, but it's essentially the same thing as Kaido with a weird stipulation of like minusing your opponent's power if you're at 10 Dawn on their turn. That's a strange effect overall. Like for purple, it feels like more of a red power level thing, but it feels like more of a red ability overall. But I think because purple just gets general good stuff, King naturally will get bumped up. Of course, I didn't put Purple Shanks above, but like I said, Purple Shanks is just kind of like more of a film package, and there's not a lot of purple film, so. Blue Purple Kaido, I think, can get bumped up. Once again, just being purple in general is good for OP08, but I don't think that this deck is necessarily that strong in general. It has potential to do well at a locals level. Once again, though, I'm going to repeat this for all the purple decks. If you're playing like a purple deck that's Animal Kingdoms or just like a mono purple, just play this Kaido and you're probably going to be doing well. You could also play purple Luffy as well, but that's a kind of a different build. I think with started at Kaido, you're building more of the Animal Kingdom, Onigashima style, playing the 10 drop, and then this one, you're just trying to ramp up fast and beat your opponent down with some mid-range bodies. Smoker, I think, belongs in the rogue tier. It is a deck that gets some support from a starter deck. There's a couple of good cards to come out of it to help Smoker at least compete a little bit better. And I don't know if people have figured out if this deck is great or not. It's a 5-life black leader, so it can take advantage of the good black stuff like Moria. It can also run 10-cost Kuzan and probably be okay dropping it on 10 because you might be at a decent life total. And there's just generally good black stuff like Rebecca Blocker. You got Brooke. Yeah, I think Smoker could have potential. We're putting it in the rogue tier. It's finally moved out of F. I don't think that this black Luffy, though, is quite good. I think that the other black Luffy, which we'll go over in a second, is better. And that because of that, I'm just going to keep it at the F tier. It's kind of a weird deck where it's like you KO something and then you get a Rested Dawn under your leader. It's just an effect that's just mediocre in my opinion. So I wouldn't really put this in even a C tier. Yamato, I talked about Big Mom being if you're playing like a mono yellow leader, just play like Katakuri. Yamato's one where you can't even take advantage of the 10-cost Big Mom. I used to think this deck was really good, but of course I think it just got power crept out of the meta. And if you're playing a mono yellow leader that is not going to be a Big Mom Pirates type, just play Enel. Or we're going to get to a new yellow leader here shortly, but I think Yamato just stays in the F tier. Same with Blue Crocodile. It is a worse version of Boa, so just play Boa instead. This blue Luffy is one that wants to go down low in hand size and then just, I guess, kind of remove the board one piece at a time. But with so many things, with so many decks being able to spit out 2 bodies at once, I think that blue Luffy can have some troubles. And because of that, I'm going to keep it here. Uta is one that I think gets bumped up to the C tier because of the purple good stuff. It might get bumped up towards the like mid-range of C tier. Not that that once again matters or not. I think this deck in OP09 becomes a competitive deck for sure. It's like almost there. This last set, I didn't think it had enough going for it. I think that going into OP08, the purple stuff you get will help you get to the red stuff that's good. And then, of course, OP09, you get a lot of good red stuff that Uta will take advantage of. So we're almost there for the Uta fans, but not quite there yet, in my opinion, to be able to go to like a Treasure Cup or a regional and do very well at. Red Uta plays around vanilla cards. I just don't see it doing that well. There's a Sanji that comes out, I think, maybe at the end of OP08. I'm not quite sure. I'm not putting it in the tier list quite yet, but it takes advantage of just like generic red cards instead. And I think you would want to play that over this Uta any day of the week. So we're going to keep Uta in the F tier. Garp is one that I think could have potential. I've seen some people cook with it and do well. So I'm going to put Garp at the C, leave it locals. It's just always had an identity crisis for me. That's like red wants to do like power reduction or rush, and black wants to do cost reduction or graveyard recursion. And so those two things don't quite mix with Garp quite as well as you would want it to. I have seen some builds that do it really well, but I don't necessarily want to put all of my eggs into one basket, you know, like stacking a bunch of Dawn onto Brook and then swinging with that one body that turn to get rid of stuff. That's probably not the optimal way to play it, but every time I play against a Garp, they're always doing that for some reason. Blue-green Sanji, being able to play out vanillas and then getting Dawn back is a good effect on paper, but I just don't think that, one, its hand size always had a problem. Of course, you could run Sanji's Peel Off, but you're not really having the time to play Sanji's Peel Off as much with this leader. You're wanting to set up stuff early game instead of setting up your hand. And so I will keep it in F tier. I don't quite see it doing well. This Black Sakazuki doesn't really change. Nothing's really done much for it. The leader ability paying 3 to KO something by, I think, pitching a card from hand and then KOing a 0 cost. I just don't like that effect at all. I don't even know if it's pitching a card from hand. I might be wrong. And if it's not pitching a card from hand and it's just to pay 3, KO a 0 cost, that's still kind of a steep cost overall for you to be able to do that. So I'm keeping it in the F tier. And then Oden, I think, is a worse version of Kinemon, and you can't cheat things out as well as Kinemon. You can get your Dawn back by pitching cards, but you don't want to be pitching cards overall. That's something that you want a big hand size. You don't want to be pitching cards. You can take advantage of the fact that there's like an Otama that came out in EB01 that can search things, and you can play, you can be my Samurai and rest those and gain a hand size from there. There is potential for this leader. I'm going to put it at the top of F. Take that as you will. It's still in the F tier for me, but I hope that maybe somebody can do well with it overall. And then on to the new leaders that we haven't talked about. We're going to go over this Black Luffy, which Black Luffy is a starter deck that came out at the end of OP07, but because OP07 I didn't cover it, I am going to talk about it really quickly. This is a character that you put 1 Dawn under, and basically all of your characters gain +1 cost, and then if you have a character that's 8 cost or more on the field, This leader gains 1,000 power. I think the ability to be able to bump your costs of your characters up is really strong in a meta where Lucci wants to KO things. It makes it harder for Lucci to do that. So I think this is a really good answer into Lucci. I think it has potential to be a competitive deck, but I don't think it's quite there. I think it's a rogue deck that probably could be towards the top of rogue, almost being a competitive deck. I like any deck that can take advantage of 10 cost Kuzan, and I think this deck does that. So I'm going to put it in the rogue tier right now. I think it has potential to be a competitive deck, so we're going to keep it here. Unfortunately, the Red Purple Law promo that we got in place of the Red Purple Law ban is just not good. It is a leader that they basically neutered our boy, so we're putting it in the F tier. Maybe eventually it will be a rogue deck. Somebody can cook with it and do all right, but it's sad. It's a sad day for Red Purple Law fans. And so on to the OP08 leaders. Finally, we are on to Tony Chopper in red and green. It's an activate main once per turn. Give up to 3 of your animal or drum kingdom type characters up to 1 rested dawn each. I think that this leader got some really interesting support in the Drum Kingdom archetype. Being able to spam out some bodies and then being able to pump those bodies up is really effective. It's like a Zoro with some green splashed in, so you can run Hody Jones if you'd like. You can run aggro packages. I think that this leader has potential to do well. I'm going to put it in the rogue tier. Keep in mind though, rogue tier is still kind of C tier. It's a leave it locals, but definitely you can cook with it and probably do well. So I think Chopper has potential. I don't think it's quite competitive. It's not the same as this Zoro. Zoro just is more efficient with its Dawn, but I would say this Chopper is almost as efficient as Zoro is. Next up we have Marco, probably my favorite leader to come from OP08. It's a red and blue leader that says Dawn ×1, activate main once per turn, draw 1 card and place 1 card from your hand at the top or bottom of your deck, then give up to one of your opponent's characters minus 2,000 power for the turn. It's a 4-life leader, and that is probably the hardest part about it, is that it is 4 life, so you do have to be very careful with how you're playing. It does run out of resources pretty easily, so you're running things like Sanji's Pilaf to gain a hand size early on into the game, but you are able to have a very strong late game if you want to go more of the Sanji Newgate. Being able to stack the top card of your deck or being able to cycle it to the bottom is a very strong effect. Power nagging is also really strong too, and then I think that you're able to play the 9-cost Sanji, which will be able to take a 9-cost or lower from the top of your deck and play it out for free, so you can stack your deck. This is probably the most effective leader for that character. You can also play Rayleigh in this deck and do really well. And when you get the starter deck in 8.5, you get the 7-cost Newgate, which I think will really push this deck ahead of other decks in the local setting. So I'm going to put it at the bottom of competitive by the end of OP08. I think you could probably argue that it's like a rogue deck, but I think that it does well against a fair amount of these decks here. It might struggle against some of the decks that pop out a lot of bodies, but you do run some removal tools like Fire Fists. You can run Gravity Blade. There's a fair amount of things you can run that will help you stay alive in that early to mid game. And then once you get to the late game and start pumping out the bodies, multiple bodies a turn, then Marco just really sets itself up for a win after that. Next up, we have Carrot, which is an activate main once per turn. If you have a Minx type character, rest up to one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 5 or less. This is a very interesting leader. I think it has potential to do well. However, once again, if you're playing mono green, I would just consider playing Bonney instead. You get the new Carrot in this set that is a 5-cost, 6,000 power body that on play and when attacking, you can freeze a rested 7-cost for that turn. That's a really powerful card to add to this repertoire. I think that Carrot, though, you should just probably play Bonney, but I'm not going to discredit Carrot overall. I think that this deck could have some merit in doing well. It does get some Minx support that I think really synergizes with the leader, being able to just like freeze things. The Electrical Luna is a really good card for this leader as well. But yeah, Bonnie's a better leader. We're going to put it in the rogue tier. Maybe with enough practice, somebody can do well with it. King is a purple and black leader that says activate main once per turn, Dawn -2. Choose one. If you have 5 or less cards in your hand, draw 1 card or give up to one of your opponent's characters -2 cost during this turn. The drawing card effect is probably the one you're going to use more often. I think along with Z, I think this leader is just a little too slow for what it's wanting to do. It wants to play very much a control style, but unfortunately being 4 life, You don't have a lot of time to set up. You do get a fair amount of ramp. You do get to play out Onigashima with this leader. You can play Tenkosu Kuzan, but I think it's around the same power level as Z for me. I wanted it to be better than what it is, but it just is a little too slow in my opinion. Next up we have Pudding, which is a purple and yellow leader for life. When attacking, you may turn 2 cards from the top of your life cards face up, add up to 1 Dawn card from your Dawn deck, and rest it. And it's the Big Mom Pirates type, which is important because you can play Tenkosu Big Mom with this leader. I think this leader belongs in the competitive tier. Towards the tail end of it, I think it's very much telegraphed how this leader will play. If you know how to play around it, which is very simple. I'll talk about it in a later video, that you can probably do well against it. However, if you don't know how to play against it and you're helping it ramp up to its 10 Dawn by your essentially like its 4th turn, then you're going to be in a lot of problems because they're going to be dropping Tenkosu Big Mom while you're still on like 6 Dawn. So it's absolutely insane if it can get to there, but it does absolutely fold against aggro decks. So Zoro, Reiju, like Chopper even, the new Calgara, which we'll get to in a second. Those decks can do really well. Even Dofi's going to do really well against it as well. So yeah, I think Pudding is a strong, like maybe beginner deck that you could probably do pretty well in, like in a big tournament, take advantage of the fact that, you know, you're pretty consistent. You have 8 searchers to get out what you need, but you are going to be like rushed down pretty easily by a lot of the aggro decks. And then finally we have Calgara, which is a yellow leader that says Dawn ×1. When attacking, play up to 1 Shandy and Warrior type character card from your hand with a cost equal to or less than the number of Dawn cards on your field. If you do, add 1 card from the top of your life cards to your hand. This is a very unique yellow leader that is all about being aggro, putting as many bodies out into the field as possible, and then just swarming the field and overwhelming your opponent. I think this deck is a very strong deck, and I think that it will be a competitive deck overall. I want to put it, personally, I want to put it towards the top end of competitive. I think that this deck is a unique yellow deck. I think it will be a deck that people are not going to be so like upset to play against, because when you think of yellow, you think of, triggers or life manipulation. But with Calgara, you're just trying to put out as many bodies. The top end is a 6-cost 8K vanilla that people were memeing when it came out and like, oh, this is the top end for Calgara. What the heck is this? But it works perfectly with it. So I think that Calgara has great synergy with the whole Sky Island package. You have essentially 8 searchers with your Shuras and your upper yards, and you can find pretty much everything you need in your deck with those 8 cards and set yourself up for success. I think this leader is very strong, and I'm going to put it at the top of competitive. I expect it to do well in some of these upcoming tournaments. So this is how I envision OP08 at the end of it being, with the structure decks and everything included. Let me know what you think about the tier list overall. What leader are you excited to play? What do you think I got right? What do you think I got wrong? Remember, keep it respectful in the comments, please. Would love to hear your thoughts. And once again, thank you so much for a whole year of support. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Cannot thank you enough for everything. Here's to another year. And as always, we'll see you in the next video.